Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into a quiet world of ink candlelight and cramped lettering so small it makes fine print look like graffiti. You're walking through a stone corridor that smells faintly of dust beeswax and very old books because, well, that's exactly what's ahead. You're entering a medieval scriptorium, a room where monks hunched over parchment in absolute silence, laboring for hours to copy the Word of God, or at least a sermon about the Word of God letter by teeny tiny letter. It's early morning, probably just after prime, which means the sun is barely up and you've already been awake for several hours. Why? Because you're a monk, and sleep is for spiritual slackers. You shuffle into the scriptorium in your rough wool robe, your sandals slapping softly against the chilly stone. The walls are bare, the windows small and high-designed more to discourage distraction than let in much light. A fire smolders weakly in the hearth, but it's not really for warmth. It's mostly there to keep the ink from freezing. You lower yourself onto a low wooden bench. Careful not to bump the guy next to you, Brother Eadbert, whose beard smells faintly of turnip soup and piety. You've both been assigned the same psalter for the next month, and your job is simple copy exactly what's in front of you. No embellishments, no shortcuts, no complaining unless you want to spend your evening copying the Rule of St. Benedict as punishment. Again. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're settling in, feel free to post your location and the local time, because nothing brings us together like mutual historical insomnia. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The moment you sit down, your joints creak in quiet protest. The bench is old, the desk slants slightly, and your knees are already threatening a mutiny. You reach for your writing tools, a slender quill made from goose feather trimmed into a sharp, clean nib. A small knife, not for defense, though you sometimes fantasize otherwise, but to sharpen your pen and scrape away errors. A scrap of cloth to blot ink, and a wooden ink pot holding a dark, sludgy liquid made from oak galls, iron salts, and vinegar. It smells like a blacksmith's salad. This is your world now. Quiet. Focused. Filled with rules and reverence. You don't write for fame or fortune, though maybe you wish you had more than 2 turnips at lunch. No, your purpose is loftier. You're preserving knowledge. You're transmitting truth. You're practicing devotion through discipline. Or at least that's what they tell you whenever your back starts spasming from hunching over parchment for 10 hours straight. The head of the scriptorium, a portly monk named Brother Aldhelm, wanders the rows behind you like a very polite ghost. His job is to inspect your work and mutter gentle corrections like, "You missed a ligature here," or more worryingly, "Do that margin again." Everyone lives in fear of again, especially when again means another 3 hours of your life poured into a single capital letter. Your quill touches parchment. The page is blank. Intimidatingly blank. This isn't paper. Remember, it's vellum made from painstakingly scraped and stretched animal skin. It's smooth, but not perfectly even, with a faint smell that reminds you of rain and regret. It cost a small fortune to produce, which is probably why you're encouraged to write small. Really small. Your first stroke is too wet. You curse under your breath, which technically breaks the vow of silence. Brother Eadbert glances at you disapprovingly. You try again. This time the eye looks good. 1 down, hundreds to go. Your hand settles into a rhythm, and soon the letters begin to unfurl across the page like a line of obedient ants. Outside, the wind rattles the narrow windows. A bell rings. Somewhere in the distance, probably towards the 3rd canonical hour, you blink. Has it really been that long already? The scriptorium hums with stillness. It's a strange kind of peace, broken only by the occasional cough, the soft scratch of a quill, or the near mystical rustle of a turning page. Sometimes you imagine the pages whispering to each other when no one's watching. It would make sense. After all, they've seen everything. Historians still argue whether monks actually liked this job or merely tolerated it out of obedience. Some think it was a form of spiritual meditation. Others suspect it was a convenient way to keep restless brothers from wandering into the wine cellar. Whatever the truth, you can't deny that the task draws you in. Time folds in strange ways here. One moment you're starting a sentence. The next, you're halfway through a chapter and your fingers are blue with ink. You pause to stretch. The candles flicker. A spider dangles from the ceiling above you, judging your spacing. You glare back. As you dip your pen again, you glance over at Brother Eadbert's page. His letters are smaller. Much smaller. Practically microscopic. Is he showing off or just nearsighted? Either way, you suddenly feel competitive. You adjust your grip, tighten your elbow, and shrink your own script by 0.5 millimeter. There. Take that, Edbert. And so the silent contest begins. You stare down at the blank space left on your current page and realize you've used up nearly all of it, except for one narrow strip near the bottom right corner. It would be the responsible choice to start fresh on a new leaf. But then again, vellum is expensive. Like truly expensive. 1 calfskin per few pages, kind of expensive. Every inch counts. So you smush the next line into that last bit of margin like you're stuffing one more sock into an already overstuffed drawer. And now you understand why the monks wrote so tiny. It wasn't always some grand theological motivation. Sometimes it was just budgeting. Vellum came from animals, usually sheep or calves, and the process of transforming a stinky hide into a smooth, workable writing surface involved scraping, stretching, drying, and sometimes cursing in Latin. You didn't waste space on something that took that much effort and had a faint but permanent odor of livestock. Even monasteries with decent funding had to ration their parchment like it was liquid gold. And when you're trying to copy out the entirety of the Psalms, the Gospel of John, and a bonus sermon on wheat storage, you start eyeballing those margins a little differently. Every blank corner becomes valuable real estate. So writing smaller that was practical. But it wasn't just about squeezing in more, it was also about aesthetic consistency. Monks weren't just copying words, they were building text blocks that had to look clean, even justified. Jagged lines or uneven spacing didn't just offend the eyes, they offended the divine order of things. Or at least the monastic supervisor, which was worse. You take a deep breath. Exhale slowly through your nose and resume the steady scratch of your quill. The desk wobbles slightly every time you lean in. Your knuckles pop audibly. Brother Eadbert doesn't flinch. Show off. Some scripts, especially the ones used by Irish monks, were downright minuscule. Insular script, for instance, could take up so little room that an entire gospel might fit in something the size of a modern notebook. Historians still argue whether this was purely economic, or whether monks simply grew obsessed with how tiny and tidy their calligraphy could become. A bit of both, maybe. In some cases, scribes use scriptura continua, meaning no spaces between words at all, which means your job wasn't just to write tiny, but to write tiny without leaving the reader a breath of white space. It's like a crossword puzzle made of Latin and sleep deprivation. Even the most devout bishop had to squint. You pause again. Your fingers have that familiar dull ache part. Cramps? Part existential despair? You gently massage your knuckles and peer at your own lines. Honestly, not bad. Your AF around your GES aren't accidentally turning into YS. Your spacing is mostly even except for one word that, yep, slants upward like it's trying to escape the page. You consider scraping it off and redoing it, but that would mean re-inking your knife and risking a tear. You let it go. God forgives slanted letters, probably. Nearby, Brother Aldhelm clears his throat in that particular way that means someone made a blot. Sure enough, a younger monk has managed to leave an ink puddle in the middle of a psalm. He looks like he wants to cry. Or join a Viking raid just to feel alive again. Your own ink is running a bit low, so you reach for the backup vial. It's thicker, older, and smells faintly of pickled walnuts. You give it a stir with the quill and resume slightly darker now, like a shadow version of your earlier self. You've developed little tricks over time. You curl your wrist slightly to stay steady. You bite your lip gently, reverently during long passages to keep from nodding off. You whisper the words in your head to maintain rhythm. Sometimes when no one's looking, you mouth them like a chant. It keeps you grounded, focused, slightly human. The letters march forward et in terra pax hominibus bone voluntatis. Peace on earth, indeed. Or at least peace in your little corner of the bench. Here's a weird tidbit you overheard once. During mealtime, some monks allegedly trained their eyes to go slightly out of focus while writing so that they could scan across the page faster. Whether that actually worked or just caused a rash of mysterious headaches is still up for debate. But it does explain why half the older scribes wear wool hoods and squint like they're constantly in pain. Your thoughts drift as you continue copying. Sometimes you imagine the people who will read your work. A bishop, a student, a particularly bored friar with time to kill, or maybe no one. Maybe your manuscript gets tucked into a shelf and forgotten for 400 years, only to be discovered in a dusty library by a scholar who immediately mispronounces your name. You wonder what they'll think of your handwriting. Will they notice that your letters got progressively smaller as you grew more tired? That you switched to ink partway through a sentence that you spelled Dominus as Domius that one time, and tried to cover it with a decorative leaf? Probably, but you'll be dead, so it's fine. Another bell rings. Sext. Midday prayer time. Your fingers twitch in anticipation. Not for prayer, though you won't admit it, but for the one glorious break where you can stretch walk and eat a humble lunch of vegetable broth and hard bread. If you're lucky, maybe there's an apple, or at least a slightly less bitter turnip than last week's. You set down your quill and breathe deeply. Across the desk, Brother Eadbert finally cracks a knuckle. Victory. He's mortal after all. The midday light filters in through narrow arched windows, tracing long golden lines across the cold stone floor. You shuffle stiffly from your desk toward the cloister where the other monks are already forming a silent procession for sext. The smell of parchment ink and slightly damp wool follows you like a second robe. Your mind still buzzes with script long curling letters and the whispery echo of Latin phrases. Even as you walk, you find yourself mentally spacing words et in terra pax hominibus. It takes real effort to switch gears from scribe to supplicant. After prayers, you settle into the refectory. Today's offering is indeed turnip stew, though one hopeful soul pokes a spoon around as if it might magically yield a sausage. It does not. The turnip wins again. You eat slowly, quietly, surrounded by the soft clinks of wooden bowls and the low hum of scripture being read aloud. Conversation isn't permitted during meals, but you all hear the same words lines from Proverbs today, something about sloth and industry. There's a small irony in hearing those words while trying to gnaw through a vegetable root with a prayer-shaped spoon. Once your bowl is empty and your limbs no longer feel like brittle sticks, you return to the scriptorium. This time you're assigned a different task rubrication. You exhale a slow sigh of relief. It's still writing, sure, but with a splash of flair. Rubrication involves the use of red ink rubrica, from which it gets its name to decorate or emphasize key letters headings or liturgical cues. Think of it as medieval boldface, but with more stains on your fingers. You carefully prepare the red pigment. It's usually made from red lead or vermilion, both beautiful and well possibly poisonous. Historians still argue whether long exposure to these materials had any major health effects on monks. Some accounts mention trembling hands and failing eyesight, but then again, those symptoms could also come from years of hunching over desks and chilly stone rooms, surviving on turnips. Who's to say? Your brush is finer than your usual quill, almost like a paintbrush for the tiniest dollhouse. You trace the capital A at the start of a prayer, watching it bloom into the shape of a curling vine. It's satisfying in a different way than regular text, more creative, less relentless. A couple of desks away, Brother Kenelm is illuminating a margin with what appears to be a squirrel playing a lute. You tilt your head. Yes, definitely a squirrel. No one questions it. These flourishes called marginalia might be whimsical, surreal, even gently irreverent, but they weren't considered distractions. If anything, they were subtle meditations in ink. Or maybe monks just got bored. That's still up for scholarly debate. And really, what's a manuscript without a dragon in the margin? Or a rooster dressed as a bishop? These oddities don't take away from the text, they offer a visual pause, a moment of levity in the middle of dense theology. You suspect half of them were inside jokes among the scribes, a medieval form of post-it note humor. You add your own little flourish, a modest red line that curls slightly at the tail. Nothing scandalous. Just enough to make the page feel alive. In the corner of the scriptorium, a new arrival is being trained on palimpsest. These are recycled pages, older texts, scraped clean so that new writing can go over them. It's a laborious process involving pumice and a prayer that the original words don't ghost their way back into view over time. Spoiler, sometimes they do. The reuse of vellum might seem miserly, but again it was practical. Why waste a perfectly good page if you could just erase and rewrite? Though as you glance over, you notice the faint outline of what was probably a sermon. Now it'll house a list of church expenses. You wonder if the original author would be offended or relieved. The scraping sound is oddly satisfying, like a cat sharpening its claws on theology. You think about how future readers scholars probably will one day pore over this manuscript with gloved hands and magnifying glasses trying to decipher every abbreviation, every ink splotch. They'll argue about the meaning of tiny marginal notes or whether your capital E was meant to reference a lost earlier version of the prayer. You chuckle under your breath. You were just trying to fit it in before Vespers. The hours pass slowly, marked by bells and the occasional yawn. Outside, a storm has begun to murmur against the windows. Rain taps gently on the glass, like a reminder to stay inside and keep working. You huddle deeper into your robes and return to your quill. Now you're assigned to a glossary section. Glosses were like early footnotes, small explanations or translations written in the margins or between lines. Often written even smaller than the main text, these tiny squiggles were squeezed in wherever there was room. You'd be amazed how many ways a monk could bend Latin to save space. As you hover over a phrase from St. Jerome, you wonder how he'd feel about you, boiling his life's work down to 3 explanatory squiggles. Then again, he probably did the same to someone else. Manuscript culture was a long chain of copying, abbreviating, glossing, and silently judging previous scribes' penmanship. Some glosses were purely practical translations from Latin into the local language. Others were personal comments notes about alternate interpretations or little ahems when the scribe disagreed with the text. Of course, that last one had to be subtle. No monk wanted to be caught arguing with scripture. Your own gloss today. A note clarifying that a particular beast mentioned in the psalm is likely metaphorical, not an actual bear. A shame, really. You were kind of rooting for the bear. And there it is again, writing small. Smaller than small. Barely visible unless someone knows to look for it. But somehow this hidden layer of commentary adds depth. It's like whispering across time to the next reader. Hey, just so you know, you finish your line, stretch your fingers, and listen to the rain as it begins to fade. The candles flicker low in the scriptorium, their wax pooling in lazy spirals along the brass holders. You blink slowly, your eyes adapting to the dimmer light. Afternoon shadows creep up the stone walls, and the air carries that cozy, dusty smell of old parchment-worn wool, and something faintly herbal, likely Brother Alfric's questionable foot salve again. There's a comfort to the monotony, like being wrapped in a warm, slightly scratchy blanket of routine. Back at your desk, your quill taps patiently against a fresh sheet of vellum. Today's assignment: a psalter, one of the most copied texts in monastic life. Monks adored psalters. They were short enough to be finished in one lifetime if you hurried familiar enough that you could almost recite half of it from memory, and structured just so with a rhythm of repetition that made it ideal for meditation or, staying awake while your ink dried. You begin with the familiar curl of the opening letter. But this isn't just any script, it's Carolingian minuscule, a standardized, neat, legible form of writing developed under Charlemagne's reign. Before this, handwriting across Europe was a chaotic mess of regional scripts, some fat and bubbly, others sharp and angular, some looking like they were scratched out by a particularly disgruntled bird. Carolingian minuscule changed that, making script tidy, readable, and most importantly, uniform. Historians still argue whether this script revolution was entirely top-down imperial policy or a more organic evolution in monastic centers. Either way, your aching wrist votes for not so organic. As you write, the letters naturally shrink more from necessity than vanity. You've only got so much vellum after all, and copying a full psalter takes dozens, sometimes hundreds of pages. The smaller you write, the more you save. This isn't just a matter of style, it's an economics lesson in miniature, literally. You glance down the row and see Brother Oswin squinting suspiciously at his own work. His script, you notice, has begun to slope ever so slightly, like a row of monks toppling in prayer. It's a common problem, script creep, when you're deep in thought and your hand starts to drift without consulting your brain? By the end of a long day, a manuscript page might look like a particularly severe hill. There's a quiet pride among scribes about how small they can write. In some cases, minuscule literally becomes microscopic. There are extant manuscripts from the 13th century written in exigua scriptura so minutely that the human eye can barely detect individual letters without magnification. It's said one scribe inscribed the entire Lord's Prayer on a single grain of rice. Historians still argue whether that story is real or just a medieval flex. You pause to rest your hand and dip your quill again. The ink today's batch is surprisingly good. It's a mixture of iron gall made from oak galls, iron salts, and a bit of gum arabic. You've had batches before that smelled like swamp water and went gritty after 3 lines. But this one's smooth as melted butter. Even better, it hasn't eaten a hole through your page. Iron gall ink had a nasty habit of oxidizing, too aggressively slowly eating away at the parchment like a tiny inky worm. Some manuscripts are half gone thanks to overachieving ink. You scratch on your hand cramped like a claw, your back singing complaints in Latin. And you think somewhere in this tiny script lies the secret to its appeal. Writing small wasn't just about space. It was about control, precision, and maybe even devotion. You can't scribble wildly when every letter has to balance on the edge of a hair. You have to slow down, focus, breathe. It's the monk version of mindfulness. Nearby, Brother Kenelm lets out a soft hiccup. He's dozed off mid-line again, his head bobbing over a half-finished sentence. You can't blame him. This work is hypnotic, equal parts discipline and daydream. You nudge him gently and he startles upright with the wide-eyed panic of someone waking from a dream about missing matins. As the bell rings for none the 9th hour prayer, you set down your quill and stretch your fingers. Your knuckles crack like old floorboards. You roll your shoulders trying to chase the stiffness from your limbs. But your eyes linger on the text you've just written. Dozens of tiny black letters evenly spaced, marching across the page like monastic ants. Each letter has weight, each word has rhythm. In a strange way, your script feels like a prayer all its own. You join the others for prayer, the words of the Psalms echoing off the high stone arches. And you wonder, did the original psalmist imagine his verses would one day be rewritten in a freezing stone room by men with cramped hands and a passion for tiny letters? Probably not. But then again, that's the quiet beauty of the scribe's legacy. Not grand, not flashy, just quietly faithful, endlessly meticulous, and just a little bit strange. After prayers, you return to your cell. There's an hour before supper, and you spend it inspecting your tools. Quills trimmed to different lengths, ink pots sealed with wax, and a worn whetstone for sharpening. You eye your latest pages. The script is even clean. A good day's work. And yet, as you examine the manuscript, you realize something: the smallest script often hides the biggest stories. Every flick of the quill contains 1,000 choices: when to abbreviate, when to flourish, when to start over. You imagine a future reader tilting their head sideways to read your gloss, wondering what on earth you were thinking, and that you suppose is the point. Tiny writing isn't meant to shout, it's meant to whisper. And if someone listens closely enough, they just might hear you 8 centuries later sighing as you correct yet another E that accidentally looks like an A. Supper has come and gone, and the hush of Compline settles gently over the monastery like a woolen blanket drawn up to your chin. You pad quietly down the hallway back to your cell, passing Brother Cadwin humming a psalm slightly off-key. The flickering sconces along the walls cast golden halos across the stone floor, and your footsteps echo faintly like the murmurs of forgotten scribes pacing the same path centuries before you. You close the wooden door behind you, and in the gentle flicker of a tallow candle, you reach for a worn bundle tied with simple linen string. Inside, a stack of marginalia samples. Not your official task, no. This is your private project, your secret indulgence. The margins you see are where a monk's soul peeks out. The formal text in the center might be scripture or the life of a saint, but the outer edges, oh, that's where the real mischief lives. You leaf through parchment covered in everything from half-sketched fish to fully armored rabbits jousting on snails. In one, a monkey appears to be administering last rites to a chicken. Another shows a rather plump bishop being chased by frogs. None of this, of course, is officially sanctioned. But it's everywhere marginalia was the medieval monk's guilty pleasure. Historians still argue whether these bizarre little images were acts of boredom-coded commentary, or just deeply repressed humor finding an outlet. What's certain is that these strange doodles were almost never acknowledged in any formal document. You'd think someone might have written by the way we added a breakdancing centaur to Psalm 84. But no. Silence. One theory. The margins were simply safer. Monks couldn't exactly roast the abbot in sermon form, but in squirrel form. Wearing a bishop's hat, entirely fair game. The text remained holy. The edge was play. As your candle sputters, you remember the story of a scribe who drew a tiny man with a trumpet emerging from a snail's shell, right next to the genealogy of Christ. Was it mockery, mysticism, or maybe just the 13th century version of a sticky note that reads, "Help me"? Another sheet features microscopic glosses, tiny notes that weave around the primary text like ivy curling around stone. These are no jokes. These are scholastic arguments, quotes from church fathers, or your own insights squeezed between lines like theological footnotes whispered through a keyhole. You try your hand at one now, quill hovering as you ponder the space between two psalms. There's a half-inch gap. Just enough for a small note about St. Augustine's interpretation of shield versus salvation. You write so finely you're almost etching with shadows? This is the art of glossa ordinaria, the ordinary gloss. It was a way for manuscripts to become living conversations where the word of God was not only repeated, but endlessly re-examined. Of course, with margins this tight, you quickly realize why writing so small was a necessity. A standard Bible might swell to 15 volumes without microglosses. With them, you can pack it all into 2 or 3 and leave a bit of room for that frog with the bishop's mitre. Your eyes begin to blur and you lean back, rubbing your temples. There's something deliciously ironic about devoting decades of your life to copying texts most people will never read in full. It's like building a castle one grain of sand at a time, knowing it might only be seen by another builder long after you're gone. Still, that doesn't stop you. You pick up a manuscript with an illuminated letter Q nearly the size of your palm, its tail unfurling into a shimmering gold dragon that sneezes tiny flowers. That's another secret: the bigger the decoration, the smaller the text that follows. A visual seesaw. Your Q takes up so much space that the scribe who followed had to practically write in insect. You blink, remembering a strange bit of trivia. Brother Julian once told you some medieval texts were written so finely they could only be read with a crystal lens, basically an early magnifying glass. And yet people used them, not just monks but nobles. 2 peering at prayer books in bed by candlelight, squinting like they were decoding divine Morse code. Historians still argue whether these manuscripts were practical tools or luxury status symbols. Probably both. A page of tightly packed script, artfully bordered and dyed with ultramarine that was medieval bling. The candle flame bobs gently as you examine another page, this one from an early Gothic manuscript. You notice something strange. The baseline shifts every few lines, subtly dipping then rising like a tiny roller coaster. It's not sloppiness, it's a response to the parchment's flaws. The skin may have stretched or shrunk during preparation, warping the writing surface. So you adjust, you adapt. The result: a living page, part perfection, part problem solving. You think about all the hands that touch these pages before you. Some steady, some shaky, some now bones beneath moss-covered stones. But the words remain. Tiny, tidy, stubbornly enduring. And when someone, maybe a scholar, 500 years from now finds this page, your page, they'll squint, tilt their head, and wonder who you were. They won't know your name, but they'll see your voice. Right there in the margins, just under the jousting rabbit. The morning bells arrive too soon. Again. You pull yourself from your straw-stuffed mattress, your legs aching from yesterday's long hours at the desk. You blink at the tiny window set high in your stone cell. No sun yet. Just the blue-gray breath of dawn seeping through. Time for prime, the first prayer of the day. You shuffle toward the scriptorium afterward, cradling a cup of thin ale that tastes like watery bread crust. As you step inside, the scent hits you a mixture of musty parchment burnt lamp oil and the faint, sweet trace of powdered pigment. Welcome back. You take your place at the long wooden table, your tools exactly where you left them. Knife for trimming quills, ruler for ruling lines, goose feather slightly split. The parchment before you is thick and off-white, wrinkled like the neck of a very old man. You smooth it gently and get to work. Today's task, copy a portion of Isaiah in minuscule script so small it might pass for ant tracks from a distance. But why this tiny lettering, you wonder what kind of person willingly writes in a font size you can barely see? Well, for one thing, vellum is expensive. Each sheet costs the life of a calf or goat. And when you're dealing with whole Bibles crammed with commentaries and glosses, every inch matters. Smaller script means fewer pages. Fewer pages mean fewer cows. And in a monastery, that math matters. But it's not just economy, it's prestige. Tiny writing is a flex. It says, look what my eyes and hands can do. It's like calligraphic bragging rights. Historians still argue whether some of these microscript pages were made more for show than for study, especially when we're talking about pocket-sized Bibles with text you'd need falcon eyesight to read. The script you're using today is Gothic, minuscule, angular, tight, and dense. The letters almost touch forming what scholars call a textura pattern. Up close, it looks like weaving, or bricks, or teeth. It's beautiful, yes, but also maddening. One wrong flick of your wrist and an N becomes an M. Or worse, a blot. You remember your training how you were taught to breathe with the strokes to anchor your elbow, to resist the urge to rest your head on the desk after the 100th letter I. You squint. Was that a smudge? No, just a speck. You gently scrape it away with the back of your knife, careful not to slice the skin. Parchment is forgiving, but only just. As you work, the world recedes. It's just you and the page. The words arrive slowly, syllable by syllable, like water dripping from a leaky roof. You're not just copying, you're inhabiting the text. You feel the weight of Isaiah's prophecy in your bones. You imagine the scribe who wrote this before you in a different century, maybe on a rainy morning. Like this one, also sighing heavily over the phrase, the burden of Babylon. You pause for a moment and run your fingers along the edge of the page where another monk once pricked tiny guide holes with a stylus. You align your ruler with these dots and draw your lines in faint ink. These are your rails, your invisible scaffolding. Without them, the script would slant, drift, tumble into chaos. With them, it's a quiet form of order. There's something strangely satisfying about this invisible infrastructure, how the most important parts of the manuscript are the ones you'll never see once the text is done. Historians still argue whether these ruled lines were part of the original planning or added midway through, especially in manuscripts that show, shall we say, enthusiasm over precision. As your hand moves down the page, you think back to the Codex Amiatinus, a massive 8th century Latin Bible that weighs over 75 pounds. It's the size of a small child, and was likely carried by multiple monks on long pilgrimages. And yet, when you examine its script, it's meticulous, tiny, and stunningly consistent. How did they do it? Probably the same way you do. One letter at a time. One prayer at a time. One long, spine-pinching hour at a time. There's a cough from Brother Felix 2 desks over. He's inking a large R that looks suspiciously like a dragon wearing a hat. You catch his eye and he winks. You try not to laugh, but a puff of breath escapes your nose anyway. It echoes faintly through the chamber. Your hand cramps. You stretch your fingers, shake them gently, then press on. The candlelight casts dancing shadows on the parchment, turning your lowercase LS into tiny sword hilts. You allow your mind to wander just for a second, imagining your words springing to life, each sentence forming a marching band of monks with banners and feathered caps. You return to the task with renewed focus. Just 5 more lines, then a break. The last line curves ever so slightly upward, as if trying to escape the page. You resist the urge to fix it. You remember what Brother Anselm always says, even crooked lines carry the word. You lay down your quill and blow gently across the ink to help it dry. As you step back from the desk, You survey your work, 12 lines of dense, beautiful, near-microscopic script, each letter holding its place like a monk in a procession. Your eyes blur a little, but the page is steady. You did it. You smile, not just because it's done, but because even in its invisibly small way, this page will live on long after you. Maybe someone will squint at it centuries from now and wonder why so small. And maybe they'll feel a flicker of gratitude for the monk who took the time. The next parchment crackles faintly as you unroll it. A new surface, a fresh challenge. The chill of the scriptorium has settled into your fingers, but there's a certain thrill in that tiny tug of resistance when quill meets skin. You brace your wrist and begin again this time, copying from a text that's been around for centuries. Boethius's The Consolation of Philosophy. Deep stuff for someone whose morning began with goat butter and frostbitten toes. Your script today is even smaller than yesterday's. It's part of an ongoing experiment in micro-writing that your abbot is obsessed with. The goal: fit the entire text into something that can be tucked inside a traveling monk's pouch. What modern folks might call the medieval version of a pocket edition. A mini for the monastic world. The letters are tight slanted and barely distinguishable from one another. They shimmer in the lamplight like spider legs dipped in ink. You steady yourself with a deep breath, then another, and begin. It might sound absurd, but writing this small has perks. Beyond the savings in parchment and the prestige of such precision, there's also the matter of security. When texts are this tiny, they're harder to tamper with. Medieval forgers are far less likely to mess with a manuscript that requires magnifying glass level eyesight just to read, let alone alter. Some historians still argue whether these miniature scripts were designed to be read at all, or if they were more symbolic, like relics meant to be revered rather than deciphered. There's a famous example tucked away in the British Library, a 13th century psalter written so small you can barely see it with the naked eye. A miracle of patience or a case of ecclesiastical overkill, scholars remain split. You press on. The lines fill slowly, then faster, then slow again, as you begin to tire. This rhythm start, flow, stumble correct is your day's music. Outside bells ring for terce the third hour. A pause for prayer. You flex your fingers, whisper your devotions, and return. Your thoughts wander as your quill scratches on. You recall the legend of a monk who allegedly wrote an entire gospel in letters so small, he could inscribe it onto a single leaf. Whether that's true or the medieval equivalent of my fish was this big, no one's quite sure. But you admire the spirit. It speaks to something very human and very monkish, the need to conquer the impossible, even when nobody's watching. You blink. Your eyes are dry. You reach for the bottle of rose water kept nearby for this exact reason, dabbing a little across your lids. Instant relief. The ancients had their own tricks, and you're not above stealing from the best. Your desk neighbor is muttering. He's lost track of a line again. He swears softly in Latin. Sanctus fumus, holy smoke. You smirk. Back to your own work. You've now copied 262 words in a script no taller than a beetle's knee. That's the other beauty of micrography, it turns scripture into sculpture. Not just knowledge, but form, art. Some manuscripts contain elaborate marginalia, where monks take this a step further, using minuscule letters to draw images, a lion, composed entirely of lines from Leviticus, a fish made from fragments of Psalms. It's calligraphy with a sense of humor, and perhaps a touch of cabin fever. The hours creep by. Your lower back aches. You shift on your stool, trying to avoid the dreaded monk's hump, a permanent curvature of the spine earned by too many days hunched like a question mark. It's a real occupational hazard, and one your older brothers in the scriptorium wear like battle scars. Still, there's a deep, almost ridiculous satisfaction in your work. It's like solving a jigsaw puzzle with your fingertips. Every letter fits into its square. Every page is a fortress of words, small, precise, indestructible. You pause and glance down at your margin. Not enough space to finish the last line. You consider cramming it in just a hair smaller. Then think better. That's how mistakes are made. You flip the parchment, prick the new sheet, and start the next line fresh. Sometimes you wonder if anyone will read this copy. if it will survive the centuries, if someone will trace your lines with wonder whispering, "Who had the patience to do this?" And maybe in that whisper you'll live again, your tiny letters whispering back. You look up. The sunlight is finally pushing through the slit window, casting a pale gold ribbon across the floor. You dip your pen one last time and finish the line. Fortune delights in her cruel game. The words hang on the page, ink still damp, barely visible, and yet utterly alive. The bell for sext hums through the cold stone walls, a cue to rise and stretch, though. Stretching in this scriptorium involves more sighing than actual movement. You arch your back, like a medieval cat joints cracking softly beneath your habit. The tiny writing has left its usual offering of stiff, neck-dry eyes and ink-stained fingers that look like you've been in a fight with a squid. And lost. You press your palm to your lower back and wander toward the window slit. Outside, the cloister garden is still frost-crusted, but someone's been at the herb beds, rosemary and lavender pruned into perfect little hedges. You inhale deeply. Ink and rosemary. The smell of your profession. You return to your station with a small clay cup of warmed ale and a dried fig tucked in your cheek. The pages await you, blank and mildly judgmental. Today's script. A commentary on the rule of Saint Benedict. Very meta. A monk copying out the words of a monk about how monks should monk. Your stylus hovers for a second, then lands with a practiced confidence. It helps that you know the rule by heart at this point. You practically dream it. You begin to write, and again your letters grow smaller. Not because anyone told you to, but because the words are so familiar that they no longer require large gestures. You're not writing to be seen, you're writing because it's part of you. And because strangely tiny letters feel more like whispers than proclamations. More honest somehow. A few desks down, Brother Renaud is deep into a genealogy scroll. You hear his quill tap. In frustration, someone's uncle married his own cousin twice removed, and it's thrown the whole family tree off balance. You smirk. Medieval record-keeping isn't for the faint of heart. As you continue, your script becomes more refined, tighter than ever before. The minims, those identical upstrokes in letters like M, N, U, and I, are dangerously close together now. To the untrained eye, it's just a picket fence of ink. But to you, it sings. Historians still argue whether this kind of compacted writing, known as Gothic script, evolved purely from economic pressure, fit more text on fewer pages, or if it was an aesthetic choice, a mark of prestige and devotion. You suspect it's both. The medieval world was nothing if not contradictory, obsessed with God, but competitive about style. You pause to sharpen your quill. It's a delicate business balancing the blade against the reed, just enough to carve a crisp edge without splitting it. You've lost good pens that way, may they rest in splintered peace. Today, though, the cut is clean, a good omen. A soft hiss across the scriptorium signals someone spilled their ink pot. Again, there's a gasp, a whispered prayer, probably for forgiveness, and a frantic attempt to blot the spill with blotting sand. You glance over, yep, Brother Matthias, as always. He's probably stained more pages than he's finished. You make a mental note never to borrow anything from his desk. Back to your page. You're writing about silence now. Benedict was big on that. Monks ought always to guard their lips, the rule says. You've always found that ironic considering how many of your brothers snore like dragon trumpets. The rules section on manual labor hits differently when you're living it. Idleness is the enemy of the soul, it warns. But at this point, you'd sell your soul for a nap. Still, there's something almost hypnotic about this work. The smaller you write, the more the outside world recedes. Each letter becomes its own room, its own prayer. Sometimes you imagine a monk in the future, perhaps a century from now, unrolling the scroll and marveling at the size of your script. Will he think you were obsessive inspired or just bored? You hope he doesn't notice the place where you almost wrote cheese instead of chaste? An honest mistake. And honestly, cheese might have tempted more brothers than women ever did. You catch yourself smiling. By now, your fingers have settled into a groove like the ruts in the stone floor beneath the cloister walk, worn by centuries of sandaled feet and muttered psalms. This rhythm, this repetition, it's not monotonous. It's monastic. You reach the end of the page. Your final words are a quiet flourish, a gentle curve, and a single drop of gold leaf ink for the capital letter. Just a dab. Nothing flashy, but enough to catch the light. You sit back. Outside, the sun has reached its zenith. Light pours in from the east window and touches the edge of your desk. You stretch again. The ache in your back is sharper now, but so is your pride. In the world of loud warriors and loud kings, you think there's something powerfully rebellious about writing so small that only the devoted will bother to read it. And even they will squint. The pages you've filled this morning feel like a secret you've whispered into parchment. Not everyone will hear it. Not everyone will care, but you will. And maybe that's enough. You flex your fingers, noticing that ink has somehow gotten onto your knuckles. Again, you have no idea how. You rise for a break, walking stiffly down the cloister walk, trailing your hand along the cold stone wall. It's rough, uneven in places, just like the world beyond it. But inside these walls, everything shrinks. Time, ambition, even handwriting. It all becomes narrower, more focused. You wander past the illuminated manuscripts drying near the warm hearth. They're part of a salter project. Layers of ultramarine blue and shimmering shell gold, making saints glow like celestial stickers. You pause at one with a fantastical marginal doodle, a rabbit jousting with a snail. Naturally, the scribe must have been especially bored that day. Historians still argue whether these odd marginalia had symbolic meaning or were just medieval inside jokes. You lean toward the latter. After all, when your day consists of copying tiny Latin phrases for hours, sometimes your brain demands snails in armor. Back at your desk, a novice monk is watching you. He squints as he tries to copy your letter forms. His G looks like it's trying to escape the page entirely. You give him a nod. Everyone starts somewhere. Even you once drew a EH that looked like turnips. You return to your script. This section includes a long list of saints and feast days. The names blend together like a liturgical lullaby. Saint Eustace, Saint Blaise, Saint Wilfilda. You wonder what they'd make of all this. Their names preserved forever, but in letters so small, even a mouse would need glasses. It's hard not to admire the sheer absurdity of it all. Imagine a heavenly afterlife where the saints compare font sizes instead of miracles. Ah yes, says, Saint Isidore, patron of encyclopedias, but was your name copied in 1.2 mm Gothic textura? I didn't think so. You glance out the window. A single crow watches you from the sill head, tilted as if judging your kerning. You whisper, mind your own business and get back to work. Your script transitions now into a hymn. The Latin flows easily, almost like song. You hum it under your breath. The tune is long forgotten, but the words still hold a rhythm. Writing hymns always feels different, less like transcribing, more like dancing with the page. There's a theory you recall that monks wrote small, not just for space, but to slow themselves down. To meditate with each letter. To make writing into prayer. Some scholars scoff at this, arguing it's far more practical. Vellum was expensive ink, even more so, and small script meant more bang for your buck. But as your hand moves, you sense there's truth in the spiritual angle. This isn't just economy, it's devotion, or maybe obsession. Either way, it's oddly comforting, like folding laundry while reciting psalms. A humble loop of motion and meaning. You take another fig from your desk drawer and bite it in half. Sticky sweetness clings to your tongue. You'd kill for a fresh pear, but figs will have to do. As the afternoon light shifts, you feel the familiar tug of fatigue behind your eyes. The room grows warmer. The scrape of quills softens. It's the hour when monks go from scripters to sleepwalkers. You press on. The current page ends with a colophon, a final flourish the scribe adds to declare the work done. You pause. It's not your place to sign your name too prideful, but you allow yourself a single flourish at the end of the line. Just a squiggle. A fingerprint in ink. You slide the page into the drying rack, taking care not to smear the ink. That's happened before. The horror still haunts you. An entire psalm lost to a clumsy sleeve. You reach for the next blank folio, its creamy surface unbroken. You run your hand over it like one might test fabric. It's smooth, cool, just slightly oily from the parchment maker's treatment. Somewhere out there, a goat gave its skin so you could write today's thoughts, smaller than raindrops. Monks were strange people, and yet you feel a quiet kind of joy. In a world full of crusades, famines, and loud kings banging on tables, you get to spend your life whispering into the future, one tiny beautiful letter at a time. The wind outside has picked up a low moaning hum around the abbey walls. You pause just long enough to tighten your robe. Cold finds every crack in these stone buildings, and it doesn't care how focused you are on a particularly tricky cue. Your ink has thickened slightly. It always does in this weather. The iron gall darkens with every degree the temperature drops. You give it a stir with a goose quill nub and mutter something uncharitable under your breath, a moment of unholy honesty in an otherwise pious afternoon. You sit back down and notice the tremble in your fingers. Not fear, not age, just cold. Cold that seeps into your bones, takes up residence in your knuckles, and makes each downward stroke feel like carving letters into stone. Monks endure this. You endure this. But really you'd rather not. Historians still argue whether scriptoria were intentionally kept chilly to preserve the ink, or simply because heating wasn't prioritized for scribes. Either way, your nose is running and your toes went numb before prime. As your eyes return to the page, you spot an ink blot. Just the tiniest smear near a capital B. It's fresh, and you already know who's responsible. Brother Evo sneezes loudly behind you again. His hay fever is legendary, a threat to any manuscript within a 3-yard radius. His sneezes have felled more decorative initials than Viking raids. You glance over and see his guilty shrug. The scribe's equivalent of a battlefield apology. You blot the smear gently and recopy the line. It's not the first time, it won't be the last. There's a strange kind of peace in knowing that error is a constant companion here. The candle nearest your desk has burned low, the wax pooling like some miniature melted cathedral. You lean in and relight it from your neighbor's flame. The gesture is quiet, but somehow communal. This whole place runs on little shared rituals. Today's project is a book of hours. The kind of thing wealthy nobles keep by their bedside luxury prayer manuals with golden initials and absurdly tiny script. The kind where Amen is the size of an ant. It's odd, isn't it? These books were never meant for public reading. No mass audience. No liturgical chanting. Just soft murmurs in private chapels whispered, while nobles lounge in fur robes. And yet you spend hours making sure every letter is perfect. Every loop on every L feels like it might decide the fate of the universe. You shift your posture again, trying to stretch out the knot in your spine. Monastic benches aren't built for comfort. They're designed to discourage falling asleep, which is ironic, considering how often you catch your brothers dozing with their foreheads in their hands. You once caught Brother Thad snoring mid-copy. His line read, "The Lord is gracious and full of," then trailed off into a jagged ink line across the margin. You preserved it as a mark of divine intervention. Sometimes the cold is joined by damp. Rain creeps into the corners of the scriptorium, and parchment swells like bread left too long on the counter. The texture goes spongy, your pen snags, and suddenly your elegant Gothic S looks more like a spider that's given up on life. To counter this, the brothers sometimes press the folios between stones to keep them flat. It helps, but there's only so much even well-trained parchment can take. When it rebels, it does so with vengeance. You mutter a quiet prayer to Saint Jerome, the patron of translators and scribes, and try again. As the bells chime for none, you realize your left elbow has fallen asleep. It's not a metaphor, it's just completely numb. But the page in front of you, it shines. A full column of text margins, tight ink crisp. The tiny letters are almost joyful in their stubbornness, like rows of ants marching in formation. You smile, maybe only slightly, but it counts. The monks believed writing was a kind of spiritual battle. Each letter formed against resistance, against cold boredom, distraction, and physical discomfort. They weren't wrong. There's a fringe theory, half joke, half lore, that tiny handwriting was encouraged to stop monks from gossiping. Keep your mouth shut and your eyes down. It's almost believable, especially after Brother Renard accidentally transcribed an entire psalm into the wrong book because he was busy whispering about the cook's over-salted stew. You think back to one particular winter when the ink froze in its pot. The whole scriptorium spent the morning holding their jars over small flame bowls, trying not to set their desks on fire. Brother Mattia succeeded in both warming his ink and accidentally igniting the corner of his sleeve. The manuscript survived. His robe did not. It's dark now. The lamplight flickers as shadows stretch across the room. The page in front of you wavers slightly. Your eyes are tired. You blink hard and refocus. Just one more folio tonight. One more chance to whisper something permanent onto the page. Something so small, so careful that it might one day be read by someone with a magnifying glass and far too much free time. You wake from a blink that lasted far too long, maybe 10 seconds, maybe 10 minutes. Hard to say. Your candle has burned another inch, and there's the faint smell of singed wool nearby. Probably Brother Evo again brushing a sleeve too close to the flame while reaching for his ink pot. The man's a walking fire hazard wrapped in vows. Still, the page before you is done. Crisp, tiny dark. Your Gothic Textura Humilis script fits 13 letters per inch, which you're both proud of and slightly worried about. You're not sure the human eye was designed for this level of compression, but it's neat, it's orderly, and more importantly, it's done. And you know what's next? Rubrication. You set down your writing quill and pick up the red one. Different point. Shorter bristles. It feels stubbier in your hand, like holding a very small brush designed for painting the fingernails of ants. But it's necessary. Rubrication, adding red ink to highlight initial letters, headings, or important words, comes from the Latin rubrica, meaning red ochre. It's a tedious but oddly satisfying process. One by one, those crimson letters pop off the page like illuminated whispers. It's the medieval equivalent of bolding text. And yes, you feel weirdly powerful doing it. Historians still argue whether rubricators were always the same people as scribes, or if the task was divided among specialists. In your abbey, it depends who owes whom a favor. You once traded 2 candied figs for Brother Paul to finish your rubrics during Lent. Highly illegal. Totally worth it. You tilt your head, looking at the margin where you'll begin a decorated capital D. Not illuminated, this isn't one of the really fancy books, but elaborate enough to feel meaningful. You dip your brush and draw the swooping arc with a practiced hand. Tiny flourishes like spiraled stems, and dagger leaf serifs require holding your breath for 2 or 3 beats. You've timed it. You actually slow your heartbeat when working on these. Not a joke. One of the other brothers has a theory that monks were the original biohackers. He's probably just bored. There's something intimate about these initials. A reader centuries from now might not see the hours behind each one. But if they look closely, really closely, they'll find microscopic inconsistencies. A tremble in the left stem, a hair's width of hesitation at the crossbar. That's you. That's your signature hidden in the curve of a crimson letter. As you work, a thought strikes you. Why write so tiny at all? You remember the answer, or at least one of them. Parchment is expensive. It's made from animal skin, usually calf, sheep, or goat, and each sheet takes hours to prepare. So, conserving space saves money. A tight script isn't just aesthetic, it's economic survival. 1 page instead of 2 means fewer animals, fewer hours, fewer blisters. Of course, that doesn't explain how your eyes manage this. Or why some scribes started going microscopic scripts so small they look like spider webs spun with ink. There's one in the archive rumored to contain the entire book of Psalms on a sheet the size of your palm. Some say it was for pocket Bibles. Others say it was a show of devotion, a way to demonstrate that God was in the detail. Historians still argue whether this was an act of humility or, let's be honest, scribe-based one-upmanship. You stretch your back, wincing. It sounds like a dry branch snapping. No one tells you how physical this job is. Your hands ache, your eyes sting, and sometimes your neck locks up like a rusted hinge. But when you hold up a finished page to the lamplight, the ink gleams just right, like black lace on cream parchment. It never gets old. From across the room, you hear the quiet scrape of a stool, and then the faintest chant, Salve Regina. A brother has begun singing softly, keeping rhythm with his pen strokes. It's not required. It's not even encouraged. But sometimes the words slip out. You hum along, more breath than sound. Your hand moves again, brush dancing from one rubric to the next. There's a peacefulness to it. Repetition without boredom. Familiar patterns, tiny deviations. You feel a little like a medieval jazz musician if jazz were made of ink and utter silence. There's a story you remember, possibly apocryphal, about a monk who went blind mid-copying and finished the book anyway. Not out of stubbornness, but because he had memorized every line. Or so he claimed. Historians still argue whether that monk existed, or if he was invented by a tired scribe hoping someone would finish his book for him. Either way, you whisper a prayer for your eyesight, just in case. Outside, the moon rises like a pale eye behind a veil of mist. You look up brush in hand, and think about how many nights you've spent in this same spot, under this same window, copying the thoughts of people long dead for people not yet born. The brush strokes grow smaller, slower, more delicate. One last swirl, one final flick. You breathe out. That's another folio done. The candles have guttered low again, and wax has puddled beside your elbow. You're not even sure when it happened. Time in the scriptorium has a funny way of folding in on itself like the loops of a letter G in your marginalia. You stretch your wrist, listen to the soft crackle of fire, and stare at the blank recto side of the next folio. You've moved on now from rubrication to layout planning. It sounds thrilling, doesn't it? Plotting invisible lines for future sentences utter medieval madness. But this is where the real artistry hides. You pull out your ruling tool, usually just a sharpened piece of lead or a stylus. Carefully, you begin scoring the page. Horizontal lines to keep your script straight, vertical margins for columns. These lines won't show in the final product, not if you're good at it. They're like scaffolding for a cathedral that gets taken down just before the Pope arrives. Mainstream historical consensus agrees this step was as essential as the script itself. Without these lines, your tiny writing would spiral off like an unhinged vine, curling into chaos. And while monks were many things overly pious, underfed, lightly flammable, we were not chaotic. Well, except for Brother Tilo. He once ruled an entire folio upside down and didn't notice until 2 days later. That page is still buried in the back of the archive, the margins quietly mocking all who see them. Historians still argue whether layout practices were standardized across scriptoria or adapted to local quirks. You lean toward the second option. After all, your own monastery favors unusually wide outer margins, allegedly to leave space for future commentary. More likely it was because Brother Elias liked to doodle birds wearing bishop hats. Once the folio is ruled, you begin the careful process of outlining the columns. Depending on the manuscript's purpose, you may need 2 columns or just 1 for more luxurious text. Pocket Bibles used double columns with famously tiny text, sometimes under 1 millimeter tall. Monks often used a magnifying lens for those. And you still lost your place. A lot. There's a myth that monks competed to see who could write the smallest script readable without a magnifying glass. If true, you suspect the prize was either dried apple slices or eternal bragging rights, hard to say, which was more valuable in 1273. You begin copying again, but this time it's a different kind of text. Not scripture, not commentary. This is an herbal manuscript. Descriptions of plants' remedies, occasionally a warning like, do not ingest more than 4 petals unless you wish to speak to angels prematurely. A sleepy part of you enjoys the shift. After hours of divine law, it's kind of refreshing to read about how to cure flatulence using crushed fennel and wine. A new kind of fatigue settles in now. Not the eye-throbbing weariness from too much close work, but the long, slow slide into dreamy repetition. Letter after letter. Ligature after ligature. You barely notice as your hand repeats the same rhythm. Your mind drifts elsewhere, to what you'll eat tomorrow, to whether spring will come early this year, to whether anyone will ever actually read this. You chuckle. Quietly. A sound like parchment sighing. The whole paradox of your job is that you write for readers you will never meet and whose lives you cannot imagine. But somehow that makes it feel even more sacred. A relay across centuries, hand to hand, 1 minuscule word at a time. You pause, rubbing your wrist. Then you blow softly on the last lines to help them dry. The ink is oak gall-based, very permanent, very corrosive over time. There's a joke among monks, your letters will outlive your teeth. Honestly, it might be true. As you wait, you glance over at your neighbor's desk. He's working on the same herbal text, but he's illustrating. That's where the color happens. Little green vines, a wide-eyed mandrake root with a face like it's seen things. His pigments are ground from real minerals, lapis, lazuli, malachite, even crushed bugs. It's like watching someone paint with powdered rainbows. You ask yourself, was this whole thing ever really just about writing small? No. Tiny script is the symptom. The root is something deeper: control, reverence, beauty. A belief that precision is a kind of worship. That God notices the tiniest things: sparrows, mustard seeds, your slightly wonky M on line 6. You begin again. Letter by letter, you fall into the rhythm. The silence presses in gently but not oppressively. It's the kind of silence that lets your thoughts breathe. That gives space for wonder and for doubt. Historians still argue whether monks truly found peace in their routines or if they just learned to call their exhaustion peace. You're leaning toward the former tonight. There's something oddly comforting about knowing your life is measured not in minutes but in lines, in letters, in strokes of a quill that hasn't been sharpened in far too long. You make a note to trim it later, after just one more column. The candle flame dances faintly as you lean in just close enough to see the minute bumps in the parchment. Your quill hovers, then drops into a groove that was once part of a sheep's shoulder blade. It's funny, every page you write on used to be an animal, and in a way you're giving it new life. A quiet, slow resurrection in Latin. Tonight your task isn't just copying or decorating, it's marginalia. The stuff readers were never really supposed to notice, but always do. Those sly little notes in the margins, the grinning rabbits with swords, the nun riding a snail. This is where the tiny writing gets even tinier. You scratch out a brief note correcting a passage in the main text. The scribe before you wrote virgin, where he clearly meant virtue. Common error, embarrassing implications. And because you can't resist adding a side note check Brother Henri's face when he reads this back. In Latin, of course. Because pettiness is eternal, but it should always be grammatically correct. Mainstream historical fact. Marginalia were often essential. They contained glosses, clarifications, commentaries, and even alternate translations. Without them, readers might misinterpret entire theological concepts. Some manuscripts are more marginalia than main text, like the commentary took over and staged a coup. But here's the fringe detail. Monks sometimes held secret competitions to sneak funny illustrations or cheeky phrases into margins without the abbot noticing. The prize, usually pride, possibly penance. Once someone inked a duck wearing spectacles into the corner of a legal codex. He's still there squinting at laws older than the hills. Historians still argue whether these playful additions were tolerated expressions of creativity or passive-aggressive rebellion against scriptorial monotony. Personally, you think it's both. You've spent enough hours hunched over folios to know a doodled pig in a bishop's mitre can save your sanity. You pause for a moment, gaze drifting across the worn wooden beams overhead. You imagine future readers, maybe even hundreds of years from now, puzzling over your annotations. Will they understand the joke about the badger bishop? Will they catch the tiny pun buried in the word spacing? Or will they just sigh, rub their eyes, and wonder why anyone ever wrote this small? You smile, because it doesn't matter. The act of writing, of thinking through your quill, is its own reward. There's something soothing about forming each letter with care, about letting your thoughts flow into ink and disappear into parchment. It's like whispering to the future and trusting the future to whisper back. You write a few more notes, all in an impossibly fine Gothic script called Textura Quadrata. It's beautiful but brutal, every letter compressed like it's trying to conserve space on Noah's Ark. You wonder sometimes whether this particular script was invented by someone with a grudge against calligraphers. It's relentless. Elegant, yes, but unmerciful. Some days your hands cramp halfway through a sentence. You flex your fingers, dip your quill again, and keep going. There's a quiet pride in knowing that your contribution, though small and scribbly, becomes part of something grand. Something that might be read in silence centuries from now, maybe even in a glass case next to a velvet robe. You glance at the side of the page. There's a thumbprint in the lower margin, probably left by a monk 2 generations ago. It's faint, but there. Ink-smudged, curved human. And just like that, you're reminded this isn't just about books. It's about people, ordinary, slightly strange, deeply devout people, doing quiet work that matters more than anyone knows at the time. Your neighbor sneezes. Loudly. Across the room, someone drops a quill with a clatter. The abbot sighs in the hallway, and somewhere a mouse rustles in the straw. Life goes on even in this dim little room filled with words no one speaks aloud. You finish the note you were working on, a correction, a pun, and a tiny face doodled into the tail of a Y. You sit back, sore tired, ink speckled, but content. Tiny script isn't just about saving space, it's about reverence, about compression, about fitting eternity into the narrowest possible margins. Sometimes it's about hiding something silly in the corner of a serious page, but mostly it's about patience. Yours, mine, ours, across centuries. You close the inkwell, stretch your fingers, and breathe in the scent of vellum and dust. Then you reach for the next folio because that's how the work continues. Line by line, letter by letter. In the margins where the real magic hides, you pull the next folio closer, brushing off a speck of straw with the back of your sleeve. The pages feel cool tonight, and the air carries the thick, sleepy scent of beeswax and parchment. Another column awaits too if you're ambitious, and tonight the letters must shrink even further. You've reached the stage where scribes get quietly competitive. The margins have grown narrower. The words huddle close together like pilgrims sharing a single woolen blanket. You catch yourself muttering, "This is absurd." But you dip the quill anyway because somewhere between devotion and mild masochism lies the medieval scribal sweet spot. The monks of the 13th century began to perfect what scholars now call micrography. You're writing in a script so small it looks like it could crawl off the page and hide in someone's sleeve. Yet you still have to shape every loop, every stroke with precision. After all, it's the Word of God, or in this case, a commentary on whether angels take up physical space when dancing on pins. Mainstream fact. The rise of tiny script in this period wasn't just a stylistic choice. It was driven by practicality. Bibles once luxuriously sprawling needed to become portable, especially for traveling clergy and students. So, monastic workshops began condensing texts. Thin, parchment-tight margins, columns as skinny as breadsticks. Some books were so compact they could fit in a pocket if you happened to be wearing an oversized 13th century monk robe with a manuscript-shaped pouch sewn into it. Now for the curious fringe bit to train for such tiny script, novice scribes would sometimes practice on eggshells. You heard that from Brother Bernard once. He swore he'd etch the whole of Psalm 23 on a goose egg with a porcupine quill. You suspect exaggeration, but honestly you wouldn't put it past him. You glance down at your own work. It's legible barely, but every letter carries the weight of tradition, of purpose, of mild neck pain. You shift your shoulders, wince slightly, and keep going. In a whispery little chapel just off the cloister, another monk begins to sing Compline. His voice drifts in soft and slightly off-key. You've always liked that. The imperfections keep it human. As you write, the question nags at the edge of your thoughts. Why this obsession with the microscopic? Why make things nearly unreadable to the naked eye? Historians still argue whether the trend toward ultra-tiny script was mainly for practical economy, or a demonstration of scholarly virtuosity, a sort of calligraphic flex. There's also the idea that smaller script demanded more mental discipline, that the act of writing so minutely trained the soul, not just the hand. You personally suspect it was also about winning bragging rights in the scriptorium lunch queue. Tiny writing often appeared in glosses, those dense clusters of notes squished into the margins around the main text. In some cases, the commentary becomes so aggressive that it looks like it's attacking the Bible in the center, like theological ivy slowly choking the trunk of a sacred tree. You smirk at the thought and add a note just beneath your current line. A little joke referencing the scriptorium's famously overlong rulebook. Something about mandatory hair shirts on Wednesdays. Outside, you hear the faint clop of hooves. A traveler arriving late. A restless donkey. Either way, the walls absorb the sound, thick and ancient. It's comforting being nestled inside all this stone and silence. You catch your reflection in a sliver of polished brass. Ink on your chin. Eyebrows tense. Eyes slightly squinted. Yep, standard medieval monk working past curfew. You reach for the sand shaker, sprinkle a little to dry the fresh ink, and admire the clean precision of your lines. They look less like handwriting and more like a pattern, like stitches in some immense holy embroidery. There's beauty and compression, in distilling wisdom down to its smallest visible form. The letters you write tonight might survive centuries long. After your name is forgotten, your voice is gone, your sandals turn to dust. Some future scholar may squint at this page and marvel at your discipline, your neatness, or your passive-aggressive side comments. You take a breath, roll your wrist, and continue. Because the next folio waits. Because you are part of a long, weird, wonderful chain of people who believed that writing real physical writing was sacred, and that even the tiniest letters, if written with care, can carry the weight of eternity. And here you are once again, nose nearly touching the parchment, hunched like a cat around the fire. The candle flickers low, now wax tunneling toward the stub, casting that golden oval of light across your work. You stretch your fingers all stiff from the endless rhythm of dip, scratch, breathe, repeat. This is the final page of the codex. You've reached the colophon, the traditional place to leave a closing note. A scribe's farewell, sometimes earnest, sometimes delightfully petty. One famous example reads, "Now I've written the whole thing for Christ's sake, give me a drink." You won't be quite so blunt, but it's tempting. Mainstream historians agree medieval colophons are some of the few places where scribes broke the fourth wall. After hundreds of pages of exacting anonymous labor, they could finally whisper to the reader across the centuries. A wink, a sigh, a joke about back pain. You consider what to write. Maybe something humble. Maybe something with a twinkle. Or maybe, as Brother Aldrich once did, a cryptic statement that future scholars will misinterpret as a coded confession to a murder. Before the ink hits the page, you pause, drifting back through all the odd, quiet rituals that led here. You remember being a novice, holding your breath as you traced your first awkward letter? You remember smuggling extra nutmeg into the ink room one winter just to make the parchment smell festive? You remember the day a goose escaped the cloister and interrupted mass, flapping madly through the nave while half the brothers tried not to laugh? And of course you remember when the master scribe let you use real ultramarine for the first time, lapis lazuli ground to dust and worth more than silver. You painted the initial B of Beatus ver quitimet dominum like it was a jewel, your hand trembling the whole time. You glance around now at the finished volume. Tiny script flows across every page, precise and proud. Some of it you wrote by moonlight, some in the sweltering heat of August. One entire folio you realize was completed during a mild but persistent sneezing fit. There's still a suspicious blotch in Psalm 66. Fringe detail. In some monasteries, scribes wrote in silence so strict that they developed an entire sign language just to get through the day. One gesture meant, pass the ink. Another meant, I've made a mistake and now I wish to cease existing. You and your fellow scribes added your own signs over time, including one for pretend to be pious when the abbot walks by. Back to the page. You write slowly, carefully. Here ends the work. May it please God. May it not contain too many errors, and may no worm eat the corners before a century has passed. You dust it with sand, close the cover, and just like that it's done. Historians still argue whether the tiny script movement faded due to practicality. Maybe aging eyes could no longer keep up, or because printing technology made such labor obsolete. Perhaps both. Or maybe because no one else wanted to spend their evenings writing a sentence that took 15 minutes just to proofread. You blow out the candle. The scent of smoke curls upward. You sit back, stretching your legs, knees cracking like old hinges. And in the stillness of the scriptorium, there's a quiet pride. You've turned the stretched skin and soot and feather into something immortal. Someone someday will open this book. They'll see your tiny letters, and whether they read them or simply marvel at their minuteness, you'll have spoken to them. Not loudly, not quickly, but precisely, like a whisper traveling across time. Now you let yourself ease back from the desk. The candle's out, but your eyes still hold its glow, phantom light, soft and warm, hovering like memory. You stretch your legs and feel the worn stone beneath your feet. The silence of the scriptorium wraps around you velvet thick as if the room itself is exhaling. No bells now. No quills scratching. Just the occasional creak of the old beams overhead, and the faint rustle of parchment settling. You did it! The pages rest closed on the table, cool to the touch, smelling faintly of ink and history. That tiny script, once so maddening, now feels like a secret song written just for you. And you alone know every twist, every loop, every spot where the quill snagged or skipped. It's not perfect, but it's real. It's yours. Let your shoulders soften. Let your breath fall gently in and out. You're not racing anyone. You never were. This was always about slow, steady care. About honoring a story with patience. About trusting that someone would one day listen. So now you lie back. Let the echo of old prayers drift like smoke through your thoughts. Let your muscles melt into stillness. The night is long, the stars are quiet, and somewhere far in the future, someone will still be turning your pages. Sleep well, little scribe.